in a lot of cases, in a lot of religions, think of God as having a plan and knowing what is going to occur in the future. Is that because he is atemporal and he experiences all of time at once? That is an interesting way to think about God. Today, we're going to be reacting to the time paradox that challenges God. We touched a little bit about time in our last video, and this is another Alex O'Connor video, but time is one of those things where the way you think about it completely changes based on your perspective on, whether you're approaching time from you as an individual or if you're thinking of time as a dimension itself. There's so many ways to perceive time, and depending on how you perceive time, it can change the possibility for there being a God, a creator for the universe. Something that is eternal, creating a universe that has a beginning and potentially an end. So today we're going to look at time, the different ways you can think about it, and one way in which time could potentially not disprove God, but discredit an argument for God. So this is going to be interesting. Let's jump right into it, and make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you like this type of content, and leave a comment below. We could have a wonderful discussion.
You've done a lot of work on the relationship between God and time. The philosophy of time and the philosophy of God are sort of complicated enough on their own, but why have you dedicated so much of your work to specifically their relation?
I think time is a fundamental, incontrovertible feature of human experience. And I think that it contains within it many of the most important theological questions we can ask. So it relates to questions about how the creator and creation relate to each other. It also raises questions about human experience, human transformation. So there's lots of theological ideas that find their home in the context of God and time. And also just on a slightly less interesting level, I find the philosophy and physics of time absolutely fascinating. Yeah. So I wanted to spend a lot of my time thinking about that, diving into special and general relativity. And yeah.
What does it mean to say that God is a timeless being, or an eternal being, or an atemporal being? Do these kinds of terms mean the same thing? Are they different?
Yeah, what does it mean for a being to be timeless, or, to be outside of time itself? Reality, we perceive it mostly through time. You could look at an object and look at its characteristics as something static. Like, I'm looking at my laptop right now and I see the keyboard keys on there, and I see the screen, and the screen could stay still. It doesn't necessarily have to be moving. The keyboard keys stay there the whole time. Nothing about that says that it can't exist without time. When you think of something that's living, when you think of a being, you think of it solely through time. Like, I wouldn't consider my laptop a being because, it doesn't change states without me touching it. It requires a being to move it. So me as a being, I move, and I have different, frames in time, you could say. I define myself through that collection of frames rather than just being a single state in time. I wouldn't have an identity if I was just stuck like this, like a statue. It requires motion and movement, and time is what allows there for to be any motion or movement at all. So what would a God who is timeless, or what would a God who is outside of the bounds of time even look like? If they were a fifth dimensional being, or a fourth dimensional physical being, what would that look like in terms of how they would identify themselves, or how we would identify them?
Ways of interpreting what that means, and what does it mean?
Yeah, so pretty much those mean the same thing. So we generally, in contemporary philosophy of time, have this distinction between God as either a temporal being or an atemporal being. The atemporal God is outside of time, has no temporal parts, doesn't experience temporal passage or change or succession in that God's life at all. And then the temporal God is within time, or experiences change, passage, succession. And the atemporal God seems to be the version that's more popular throughout theological tradition, although they're not using quite the same categories that we use today. And the temporal God is seeing a resurgence in the contemporary discourse.
So why the popularity of the atemporal God before, and why the shift?
So there's a few arguments that we could give. Some of them are rooted in Platonic philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea that God is a perfect being means, Plato made this argument that something that's perfect doesn't change, because if it changes, it in some way degrades from perfection. So if God is perfect, then God doesn't change. And if we think of time and change as linked together, then God is outside of time. God isn't subject to the passage of time.
Why?
That's an interesting way to put perfection, something that can't change, because if it did change, then you are moving away from that perfect state. But you can view a perfect process. Like you could say, I want to run the fastest possible race. I want to run the perfect 100-meter dash. And that would consist of a perfect start, a perfect driving phase, and then a perfect finish. And all of those things together are different. All of those parts of the race are different from each other, and you're moving through those parts of the race. But the progression itself is perfect rather than it being a single state. So I don't necessarily think that for something to be perfect, it has to be atemporal, because you could say that, it is a perfect collection of things. It's a perfect collection rather than a perfect state.
Would change require degradation from perfection? This was something that jumped out at me from reading your work. I understand that in a sense. It sounds plausible, but it also seems plausible to me that there are ways of changing that don't improve or detract. I mean, is there something necessary about change that would detract?
Well, not necessarily. So one of the objections is that from the temporalists is to say there's no change in God's perfection if his knowledge changes from the time is 2:00 to the time is 1 minute past 2.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the kind of change that's required for God to be a temporal being. So there's no challenge to his perfection. I think the perfection and change argument is one of the weaker ones for the atemporalists, but it had a powerful sway over people in history.
Yeah. Can we make sense of the question, does God know what time it is right now? And do we require, in order to say yes, do we require that God is temporal? Or can you have an atemporal God who knows what time it is right now?
Yeah, does God, if a God existed, would he engage with people at the current time that they're experiencing it? Or would he engage with those people at every single, if you look at time, every single point in time already exists. So you could think of it like a lot of physicists believe that every single point in time already exists, but we're just moving through it and experiencing it. So the future already exists, the past already exists, and it's always occurring, but we just experience one node of time at a time. So if God will interact with us in the future, and God has interacted with us in the past, and he interacts with us now, does he perceive all those interactions at once? Is he constantly interacting with all people at every single point in their lives? That's an interesting, fascinating thing, because if you're religious, you don't really view your God as, jumping around in time, but you do, in a lot of cases, in a lot of religions, think of God as having a plan and knowing what is going to occur in the future. Is that because he is atemporal and he experiences all of time at once? That is an interesting way to think about God.
Because I'm speaking in the temporal sense. I'm in the temporal world.
Yeah.
Could a timeless God know what time it is now?
Yes, but if you endorse the idea of a timeless God, you normally in contemporary discourse at least, endorse a view of time that says there is no time that it is now objectively. So an atemporal God knows what time it is at all points in space-time, but there is no objective now. It's called the block universe view. I can talk a bit more about what that is. And whereas a temporal God knows what time it is now, because normally you would have this marriage of a temporal God and a version or a theory of time where time does objectively pass and there is a now. So God knows what time it is now, and that knowledge is continuously changing as time passes and the future becomes present and goes to the past. But if you endorse an atemporal God, you think of the relationship generally between God and time as one a bit like an author holding their book, or like a novel. All the pages exist, all of the events that happen to the characters, each moment in the character's life is all there. And God knows all of those things that happen and can look at any point. And there is no objective, it's objectively page 33 now. That doesn't make sense when you think about a novel. And so this is the version of time that goes with the timeless God. And it's the version of time or theory of time that I think is best supported by modern physics.
I mean, the character in the novel could say, like, what page number am I on?
Yeah.
And there is no objective page number for the author, but the author can know where they were when they said that, and that might be, God would know where I am on this time block. I think most people will be roughly familiar with the idea of the block universe versus, the part where the past and the future and the present all exist on this big block, versus the idea that the past doesn't exist, the present is the only thing that exists, and the future doesn't exist yet. Some people might even know that they are broadly referred to as, respectively, the B theory and the A theory, or the B series and A series of time. But there is also a C series of time, isn't there? What is the C series of time?
So the A theory, B theory, C theory, or A series, B series, C series come from a 1908 paper by J.M.E. McTaggart called On the Unreality of Time, or The Unreality of Time. And he draws a distinction between three different ways that you can describe positions in time. We've already talked about the A series and B series, so I don't need to go over that again.
Let's see. Would the C series be, you could view time as like the past exists and the present exists, but maybe the future doesn't exist yet, and we're creating that as we go?
Well, maybe I will, just so I can show the difference. So the A series describes positions in time by virtue of their possessing objective properties of past, present, or future. The B series says time can be fundamentally accounted for by giving relations of before, after, than, and simultaneous. So you've got these two-place relations. And the C series says all you need to describe time are these three-place relations of temporal betweenness. So what that really means is that you have this series of time, of moments in time, and they have a particular order with respect to how they're arranged, but there's no objective direction. So it's a bit like the colours of the spectrum. You can start with red and move to the blue end, or you can start with the blue end and move to the red end. And so what that means, the C theory of time is also committed to a block universe. It says all moments of time exist tenselessly, but you don't have to read the universe, as it were, from the Big Bang to the heat death. If the universe is going to end in a heat death, it makes just as much sense fundamentally to read the universe from the heat death to the Big Bang.
So I wouldn't think that the B series would be any different, if the B series is the block universe, is any different from the C series, because if all points of time already exist, then why would there be any directionality at all? If you can view all the points of time at a single time, why would it matter if there's any direction at all? How would you view there as being any direction? But I guess like if you have a book, you can view it as a direction, but I don't think the B series is too fundamentally different from the C series. The direction is just an added perception, because like you could read a book backwards. Of course, that's not how we do things. That's not how we experience it. But in terms of describing time itself, I don't think there's much of a difference, because the directionality doesn't change the function of time objectively, only for our perception.
Even within those different theories, there are different interpretations of the theory. So, I mean, it's quite hard to wrap your head around exactly what we're talking about, but we said the A series says that the present exists, the past doesn't exist anymore, the future is yet to come, there is no block. But there is more than one way of interpreting what that means, what the A series is. And there are sort of three popular broad distinctions, right, within A theory of time. That's
right. I think the one that I see most often endorsed is presentism, which is the A theory you just described. So all that exists is the present. So you need an objective now, and everything that's simultaneous with that now exists. Nothing else exists. Then you have what's called the growing block theory, which is committed to the existence of the present and says that the past exists. So as new slices of time that are the present come into existence, they when they go when they become past, they are then added to a block, like the block universe, but that grows with ever more present moments.
So that's what I guess the C theory was, but it's just another iteration of the A series. If you view time as only being the present, that just seems like kind of impossible, knowing what we know about general relativity, and somebody can experience time at a slower or faster rate than somebody based on how close to the speed of light they're moving or how much mass that they have. Not saying anybody has enough mass to notice a difference, but in terms of one body moving closer to the speed of light, we know that they move through time slower than everything else around them. So that, I feel like, very much discredits this view of time.
Future is not real. And then you have the moving spotlight, which is also committed to a block universe like the B and C theory, but says that there's something, and I'm not really clear about what that's supposed to be, that picks out objective nows, a bit like if you had a street of houses and you have a spotlight that moves from one house to the other, there's something privileged about the house that's being lit up. And that's the idea with the moving spotlight view. So it tries to have the best parts of the B theory and the best parts of the A theory. And in so doing, I think it comes up with something that basically no one endorses.
Yeah. But then, I mean, I like this idea of like privileging the present, because there is something special about now, by which I mean, you know, there was when I said the word now. But even for the B theorist who thinks that all time exists and the past and the present are just as real, you know, surely they still can't escape the idea that there is, for want of a better term, something privileged about what at least we consciously call the present. Like, how do they make sense of the psychological experience of time if the present exists just as much as the past does?
I think that we just evolved as three-dimensional beings on like a four-dimensional plane. And I know there's more than 4 dimensions, but like I think we'd evolved to only experience time as something where we only are able to experience it in slices rather than experiencing it in its entirety. And it would take a different type of evolution, and I don't know what that would look like, and maybe it would require like a multiverse or something like that to have a being where they could experience all points of time at once. But if you're like a three-dimensional being moving through the fourth dimension, then you can't experience the entire fourth dimension. You don't take up the space of the fourth dimension. You just can experience it one slice at a time. So of course you're only going to notice the present because you only notice where you are on that plane. You can't see way ahead of you. You can't touch in front of you or behind you. You can only touch where you're at.
That's the biggest objection to the B theory, and I guess the C theory as well, is how do we account for our temporal experience?
Yeah.
My response to that is always, well, our experience deceives us all the time. I feel like I'm sitting on a solid chair. I can feel the velvet underneath my fingers. But actually, this chair is made up of mostly empty space, and it's the atoms in my body reacting or like repelling the atoms in this chair. And so our experience has evolved in the context of the environment of early evolutionary adaptation. And hasn't evolved to be able to pick up things like the ontology of time in a way that's reliable enough, in my view, to go against what science tells us about time. So I think the B theory is best supported by science. And therefore, I'm more skeptical of my experience. Of course, from my experiential perspective now, feels incredibly privileged. It's the only thing I can directly experience. But that doesn't mean that the other moments of time aren't real. I can't directly experience India right now, but it doesn't mean India doesn't exist. It means that I'm not there.
Yeah, and it seems like less of a mystery to explain.
Right.
Probably just because you feel like if I wanted to, I could get up and go to India in a way that I can't like get up and go to the past. But that shouldn't change the nature of what we're talking about.
It's more difficult for us to move through time than it is for us to move through space. That doesn't even mean it's physically impossible for us to do, just because it's hard. It's just not how we experience time. It's not the control that we've evolved to have over time. Maybe it is impossible for us to evolve to have that sort of control. Maybe it is impossible for there to be a 4-dimensional being, but you can certainly conceive of what that would be like. And you could certainly think of that being possible, even if you can't physically do it in your reality.
So actually, I was going to say back to theology, but just before that, you said a couple of times now that you think the B theory is best supported by science. Mm-hmm. Is that because of relativity, or is it something else?
Yeah, so the A theory is committed to this absolute present moment, as I've said a few times now. And that requires there to be a universal plane of simultaneity, such that everything that exists can be simultaneous with the now. According to special relativity and later general relativity, this isn't the case in the world or in the universe. We just don't realize, because we never either accelerate to significant fractions of the speed of light, or go to planets or much closer to the sun with big gravitational fields. If we did that, then we would realize that time passes at different rates, depending on your speed and depending on your proximity to a gravitational field. So if, we see this in like the film Interstellar, when somebody goes onto a massive planet and then goes back to the spaceship. For the person on the spaceship, 20 years has passed. Whereas for the people on the planet, it was like an hour or something. And that's not just science fiction, that's solid relativistic physics. And therefore, if that's the case, then we don't have this universal simultaneity and we don't have this objective now.
Without getting into it too deeply, we should flag that there are people, the so-called Lorentzian view of space-time, Neo-Lorentzian, I don't know what Lorentz refers to, who do try to reconcile the A theory of time with the mathematics of special and general relativity, right? Like, they do exist, but you just don't place much plausibility into that. Like William Lane Craig is an example, right? You write about him. I've spoken to him about this, I think, years ago when I spoke to him and asked him about God's relationship to time. And he just said, well, God was timeless. And then when he created the universe, he entered into time and became temporal. And I was sort of like, huh? Like, what? And I still haven't quite wrapped my head around it. Maybe that's just me. But you think that
doesn't make sense to me either. No, if God was timeless before creation, then God is in a temporal relation with creation even before creation has existed, and therefore he's temporal. So, and this is an objection that's been raised to Craig, and he hasn't come up with a compelling response.
I feel like an analogy for that would be like if you were a 3D being and you created something 2D, then you would become a 2D being. That doesn't really make any sort of sense. Maybe that analogy is broken, but I feel like that's a good analogy. Like if you're a 4-dimensional being or like a atemporal being, and you create a 3D universe, then you wouldn't just become a 3D being and be subject to time all of a sudden. It doesn't make any sense.
He's an atheist. I think it's one of the things that he believes most deeply about the world.
Really?
And therefore has to come up with a way to explain relativistic physics. So he's devised this Neo-Lorentzian interpretation. It's very much his baby. And it's Lorentzian in that Lorentz was committed, this physicist in the early 20th century, to the existence of a background structure that functions as an absolute frame of reference against which you can measure the absolute passage of time.
Like an ether.
Yes, it was the luminiferous ether, which was famously disproved by the Michelson-Morley experiment. So that's why it's Neo-Lorentzianism, because it's saying, well, we like this idea that Lorentz had, but we're not going to commit to the ether. We know that's not that doesn't exist. So we're going to try and find another background structure. But really, Craig's arguments are theological in nature. So he believes that God must be temporal and that there must be an A theory of time for theological reasons. And unfortunately for Craig, the Neo-Lorentzian interpretation of special relativity has not really taken off anywhere outside of the philosophy of religion.
Well, I mean, if you start an argument, if you start a theory on the basis that God does exist, if you make that assumption, then it is going to be like trying to force puzzle pieces where they don't fit, trying to make everything work for that assumption. All this conversation doesn't automatically negate the existence of God, but it does kind of question whether it's possible for him to be a temporal being. Like it would make most sense for, if there is a God, for that God to be an atemporal being who can see all points at time at once and can interact with all points at time at will. The universe that he created would be their domain and would be completely subject to their control and their tampering with. So yeah, it will also necessitate that the time structure that exists, the timeline that exists for the universe, that God would have to have knowledge that that time structure exists, and they would have had some sort of intent for it being the way it is. So there's a lot to discuss there with that implication. But if you like this video, like I said, leave a like and comment whether or not you think that it's possible for a God to be temporal in a temporal universe. If you want to see more videos like this, subscribe to the channel, and we post every single week. So I will catch you guys on the next one. Thank you for watching. I'll see you guys soon.